Hey guys, it's Timothy here, bringing you 5 limited tricks you can use for your next Eldritch Moon or Shadows over Innistrad draft. Keep in mind, these aren't necessarily the most powerful things you can be doing in the format, but they are neat little tricks that have come up during different games that I've played. These are intended for newer players, and they're definitely not something you really want to bring into the standard atmosphere, but it gives you a second light at looking at certain cards. The first card we're going to look at is Summary Dismissal. This is 2 and 2 blue for an instant that says exile all other spells and counter all abilities. Now when you look at this card, you probably think of very recent examples of counter spells that have the same mana cost but really don't do that much else than counter a card. They're usually very clunky. Sometimes they're playable, sometimes they'll make your deck, but you don't often want them, and they're usually around that 23rd card in a limited deck. Summary Dismissal is very close to the same thing, but has a couple other things going for it here. First off, it counters all abilities in addition to exiling a spell or spells if you need it to. This means it's tailor-made for taking care of emerge cards, which give you a cast trigger on top of the creature that you're casting. Cast Summary Dismissal against an opponent who has just emerged a creature, and not only will they lose their cast trigger, but they'll lose the creature, and in addition they already sacrificed a creature to put those abilities and creatures on the stack in the first place. Summary Dismissal is great sideboard tech against it. The part about countering abilities is relevant against certain very powerful cards, especially Planeswalkers. Normally when someone plays a Planeswalker in Limited, they tick it up, tick it up, tick it up, do everything they can to protect it, and then try to win with an emblem. Well, if your opponent has Liliana or Tamiyo or any other Planeswalker for that matter with an ultimate ability, they're going to -7, and you can respond with a Summary Dismissal, which will counter the -7, and Liliana will be dead, assuming she only had 7 counters on her. This is a very clutch situation, but it kind of highlights how you can use Summary Dismissal to counter abilities. The reason I wanted to mention Summary Dismissal is because you can do something with it you may not be aware of, and it may not be immediately apparent why you would want to do it. That is, you can cast Summary Dismissal doing absolutely nothing with it. It's not actually a counter spell unless you're countering an ability with it. It doesn't need a target in order to go on the stack, meaning you can pay blue and 2, put it on the stack, and if there's nothing else on the stack, it does nothing at all. Why would I want to pay 4 mana for a card that doesn't do anything? Well, there is a blue-red spells deck that's very, very important, and the reason that this came to my attention is because my opponent actually could have beaten me at my last FNM if they'd known. They could have tossed out their Summary Dismissal for a trigger, not actually doing anything with it, given their Geists, their 2 Geists, might I add, +3/+0 each, adding 6 power to the board and swinging in for lethal. Instead, they thought they had to have a target in order for Summary Dismissal to be cast, and it was stuck in their hand. This is also true for anything that wants you to cast instants or sorceries like Thermal Alchemist or creatures with prowess. Sometimes you just need to get that last trigger off, and if you're stuck with a counterspell in hand, you may not be able to do it. Whereas Summary Dismissal, while it may not do anything on its own, can be a card you can just toss out there to get those winning triggers in a blue-red deck. It's also pretty good against werewolf decks in general. It can be used to counter the transform ability, or it can be used to stop the transform ability from triggering in the first place, which might be really relevant against a dedicated red-green deck with mostly werewolves from Shadows over Innistrad. Just something to keep in mind next time you see the card. Again, I'm not advocating for first picking in it. I do believe it is still a sideboard card at best, but it does have very good applications, and the fact that you can cast it for free gives it just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit more relevance than I may have initially thought when I saw the card. The next card I want to mention is Ruthless Disposal, something I found out very recently about it. Ruthless Disposal reads, as an additional cost to cast Ruthless Disposal, discard a card and sacrifice a creature. 2 target creatures each get -13 until end of turn, essentially wiping out 2 of your opponent's creatures. However, if your opponent only has 1 creature on board, you may be disincentivized to use it, since it seems like you're going to have to kill one of your own things in addition to sacrificing one of your own creatures. Well, I'm here to tell you that that's a little bit less tricky than you think it is due to the way that cards are actually cast. Imagine a scenario in which you have a Brazen Wolves, your opponent has a Crusader, and you just really need to get the Crusader off board, but you don't have another creature to sacrifice to Ruthless Disposal, and you know you're going to have to kill your Brazen Wolves. Well, the interesting thing is you can actually use the creature you sacrifice in order to pay the condition of targeting a second creature. If these are the only two creatures on board, I can target them both with Ruthless Disposal and then sacrifice Brazen Wolves to fulfill the conditions of sacrificing a creature to cast the card. Very interesting, and it sounds incorrect, but I double checked it and it definitely passes the test straight from Wizard's website. So you cast the Disposal. Before you pay cost, you target two creatures. It can be one of your opponents and one of your own if you really need to take down an opponent's creature, but they don't have another one to target. Then you have to pay costs after targeting. You're going to sacrifice your Brazen Wolves, meaning it's no longer on board, but Ruthless Disposal still has a target in Markov Crusader, meaning it'll do as much as it possibly can, which is give it that last creature -13, essentially taking it out. In other words, if your opponent only has one creature, you can use Disposal the way you intend to take down that single creature. It doesn't seem like this is what the card was intended to do, but it is something you can do with the card, and it's definitely something that will bypass most people. In fact, I didn't even know about it until I heard it from a very recent draft on Channel Fireball, and it struck me as incorrect, but it definitely pans out, and you can do it. Very, very interesting. Next up on the list, we'll be talking about Not Forgotten. This is technically limited to only Shadows over Innistrad, and it's also with a card that's not very playable on its own, but I thought it was interesting and worth mentioning anyway. The card Not Forgotten, which ironically most people have probably forgotten, is a sorcery for 1 and a white that says put target card from any player's graveyard on the top or bottom of their library. You also get a 1/1 spirit creature with flying, and put onto the battlefield when you cast Not Forgotten. So it's kind of a weird cycling type card that you can use to rebuy things or mess up your opponent's turn, and you get a 1/1 in addition to it. I don't think I've ever played the card, and I wouldn't advocate for playing it, but it is worth noting that it actually loops with a second copy of Not Forgotten. If you get one into the graveyard, you get a spirit, and then the second copy of Not Forgotten can put the other copy back on top of your deck, meaning you'll draw it next turn. You can cast that Not Forgotten on the one you played in the first place and keep looping them turn after turn. And keep in mind you also get that little spirit every time, so you can build up a board this way. This doesn't seem very strong since it's essentially meaning you're not drawing anything new, but if your opponent is really, really behind and you have creatures that care about how many creatures you have on board, or if you have some sort of spell type deck that really wants you to be casting instants and sorceries constantly, then this might be a loop that you should be aware of. Also, keep in mind, Not Forgotten is not a card that players typically pick, so you can get them very, very late, even though there's only one pack of Shadows over Innistrad now. Why would I want to loop Not Forgotten? Well, if I'm in a spell-based deck, maybe I ended up in 3-color Jeskai, or if I'm just red and I'm looking to fill out the other half of it, or if I have blue Spell Matters cards, then we could definitely use Not Forgotten to take advantage of this. Consider Niblis of Frost, Docent of Perfection, Weaver of Lightning, Pyrehound, a couple others like Thermo Alchemist. These cards want you to be constantly casting spells, and the Not Forgotten loop is a way to make sure you're casting a spell at least every turn. Although you may not be casting the most powerful spell in the game, you are adding to your board with the spirits while also triggering some sort of unique and definitely powerful effect off of your creatures. I can't advocate for actually wanting to do this, and I'm not entirely sure I've ever seen it happen, but it is something to be aware of, and it is a neat trick that is worth sharing with people who may have completely forgotten that this card exists. Next up on our list is something that may not be necessarily surprising since it's actually written on the card, but something you may not have absolutely considered what you can truly do with it. That is using your opponent's Mirrorwing Dragon against them. Mirrorwing Dragon is a very strong card, and an absolute bomb in Limited can be very hard to deal with because of its unique effect, but gives you an actual advantage depending on what kind of cards you're playing. Keep in mind your opponent has the same access to this advantage that you do, but using your opponent's card against them is always sweet. Mirrorwing Dragon has a very unique effect. If I have a bunch of creatures and my opponent has a Mirrorwing Dragon, when I try to target them with a removal spell, it actually reflects onto each creature I control, or at least each creature of the person controlled by the person who casts the card targeting Mirrorwing Dragon. So if my opponent tries to target their own Mirrorwing Dragon, they get to reflect that spell onto all of their creatures. If I target their Mirrorwing Dragon, it reflects all those spells onto my creatures, making removing Mirrorwing Dragon an extreme nightmare, since it usually means I'm going to kill a bunch of my own guys in the process. However, take out a removal spell and change it with, I don't know, some sort of pump spell like Uncaged Fury, and suddenly that spell is copied onto all of my creatures. Keep in mind, it has to be a spell that only targets Mirrorwing Dragon, so something like a fight spell or something with multiple targets will not work. But imagine a situation in which I'm putting Uncaged Fury on Mirrorwing Dragon, and suddenly all of my creatures are +1/+1 in double strike. Keep in mind, there's a downside to doing this. My opponent's dragon is suddenly stronger with double strike, but I could use this to potentially win a game. Imagine that I just have the creatures that I've thrown down here, ones I just picked up randomly. I'm going to be able to deal a lot more damage this way than I could have just using Uncaged Fury on a single card. The same goes for cards that draw, or things that give clue tokens or put permanents on board. Examples being things like Confront the Unknown, Survive the Night, Make Mischief. Target Mirrorwing Dragon, and then suddenly I'm targeting all of my own creatures. They resolve one by one, and each Confront the Unknown gives me an additional clue, or an additional +1/+1 on top of each one that resolves for it, since each one gives me a clue. Not to mention I'm gathering up those clues to draw a bunch of cards later. Very similar to Zada Hedron Grinder, but can actually be used against your opponent if you have the right cards in your deck. Doesn't really make Mirrorwing Dragon less of a pain to deal with as far as removing it from the board, but gives you some outs as far as getting around it or using it to your advantage. And final trick I want to bring up here, something that I thought was absolutely crazy because it's something that will totally go over everybody's head, something you probably didn't notice when you read the card. Repel the Abominable does a little bit more than you might think it does. It reads, prevent all damage that would be dealt this turn by non-human sources. The term there being sources, really, really important. When you read it, you automatically think, well, this is a fog for human-based decks. Obviously, my opponent's going to have some big creature in their deck. Having a fog might just be what I need to blanket for a couple turns. You might even get a little tricksy and notice that it stops damage off of fight effects, particularly from cards like Somberwald Stag, Clear Shot, Rabid Bite, Prey Upon, anything like that. Assuming it's not targeting a human that's doing the fighting, it will prevent that damage. But the very, very important part here is that nowhere on Repel the Abominable does it say combat damage, meaning that you can actually use it to blank burn spells. Consider a card like Collective Defiance. Your opponent escalates it once, 4 damage to target creature, 3 damage to you. Absolute blowout card. It's going to bring you way down. You're now in the red zone. Your creature's dead. Crazy card. Well, Repel the Abominable actually stops the damage from this card. It is a non-human source. There is no tribal, so instants and sorceries are not human instants or human sorceries, and it doesn't have to be combat damage. It just has to be a source, which pretty much any card you cast is going to be a source. Repel the Abominable stops this. It stops cards like Collective Defiance, Fiery Temple, or Lightning Axe. In particular, let's look at Nahiri's Wrath, an absolute crazy bomb of a card in Limited, can completely wipe a board and turn a game around for almost no cost besides discarding a couple lands and a couple cards. Can completely decimate a player's field. Imagine a situation in which someone Nahiri's Wrath and you respond with a Repel the Abominable. Well, last I checked, Nahiri's Wrath is not a human source, so QQ for your opponent, it actually prevents the damage dealt by Nahiri's Wrath. Pretty crazy and something I don't think a lot of people have noticed about the card. 9 times out of 10, you will use Repel as a non-human fog when it comes to combat. But the fact that you can blank an Incendiary Flow or a big bomb like this with a 2-mana uncommon spell that's meant to be a combat fog is really, really unique and something that definitely requires consideration when it comes to sideboarding against red decks. If you have this card, keep that in mind. It stops burn. Well, guys, that's all I have for you here. I hope you appreciated these tips and tricks for Shadows over Innistrad and Eldritch Moon Draft. Again, I'm not saying go first pick Summary Dismissal, and by all means, I'm not really even saying take Not Forgotten. It's a bad card. But keep these in mind, especially Repel the Abominable. I think that's a really awesome trick to be aware of. If I missed any tricks that you think are just definitely worth sharing, I would love to hear about them in the comments below so we can have a discussion. And it might just be that you bring up something that I wasn't aware of, just like the Ruthless Disposal thing I heard about very recently but saved me in a game on F&M. Anyway, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. My name is Timothy. Thank you guys for taking the time out of your day to watch this. I appreciate you all, and I will see you next time.